just raised a question in my mind. I read an article the other day, Jim, about should there be an Eastern European social psychology? So, you know, when we aren't just talking about Indigenous populations because, well, I guess Celtics are Indigenous people, aren't they? Celts, the Scottish are Indigenous people. So I was really glad when my father said he was Scottish and Danish because I know that there's indigeneity. But, you know, when you look back far enough, there is indigeneity amongst the peoples of the world. And so, for example, in Canada, the Canadian psychologist's version of indigeneity is local Canadian population psychology, isn't it? So they're trying to pull away from the impact of the United States and the pervasive form of psychology.
Now, does anyone want to make any further final comments on the first question? Anyone who wrote on it and hasn't spoken about it yet?
I need to go to the toilet. It's not a question, it's a statement.
Any of you who wrote on the first question? How many of you wrote on the first question? Okay, Flora, you want to add anything to the discussion?
Well, what I want to add with how many Indigenous psychologists there would be, I think it also depends a bit on the Indigenous people themselves. Because what I read in the Allwood and Berry article was that most people who wrote, like, answered their questions said that Indigenous psychology kind of started out of dissatisfaction with the Western dominance in psychology. But I think if there are like two Indigenous groups that are quite similar but still different, but maybe if one of them starts like an Indigenous psychology, the other one might recognize enough in that Indigenous psychology to kind of unite in it. So it doesn't have to be that every culture-specific group has an own Indigenous psychology, as long as they feel comfortable within that Indigenous psychology they create.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So that you really have to be so careful about this differentiation, integration, and what's comfort level within that. So the Balkans would be the perfect example. From the outside, from my perspective, boy, those different little countries in the Balkans sure look similar. They act really similar, but they have this horrible history, and because of this horrible history, they're not going to be comfortable saying that Slovakian psychology goes with Slovenian psychology, goes with Croatian psychology, goes with Montenegrin psychology, goes with Serbian psychology. You know what I'm saying? So they're not in a space where they can comfortably accept that level of integration. And it has tremendous cost to them. I mean, obviously, in terms of lives lost, but knowledge lost, all these kinds of things. So you're right. That's a very tough kind of issue to deal with. And the Indigenous psychology floats along these political currents. So and if you read the New Zealand one that we assigned, that's not floating. That's a torrent of within the political milieu of the day. And sometimes you take a very strong political position in order to try to achieve something. So, at that time, Maori psychology in Aotearoa was completely non-existent. It was just invisible. And they needed to take an extreme position to try to move things forward. And as Kiri says, a lot more has happened since then. So that's great. Who else did question one?
I don't really have anything further to add, but just the difficulty of integration kind of throws me. It's just there's like the dominant culture, like to an extent, it doesn't want to let people integrate. I find I've experienced that in Germany with Turkish immigrants. It's just not happening, and it's and then people complain. I think they should just integrate, blah blah. But how would you integrate when you don't let them? I don't know, just kind of. It's quite mind-boggling.
Yes.
It's quite difficult to get your head around and sort of think of a solution that there even is.
Yeah, I mean, what you need to realize is that among some scholars, and I don't completely agree with them, Some scholars claim the idea of a nation is relatively recent invention. You know, you don't have to accept that, but in this kind of thing, the idea would be that what you're doing in creating this idea of a nationality is actually supporting and warranting the boundaries of your current state. So the state is a homogenizing institution, and what the state should be trying to do is homogenize these Turkish migrants.
Yeah.
But if the local populace doesn't necessarily embrace that, then can the state actually achieve that? Generally, no.
Well, I feel like it's expected, you know, like we talked about earlier on, like to put your head in and sort of just don't be obvious. And you know, sometimes you come from a different culture and you don't want to just like put your head down and not be obvious. And so, and I feel like often, at least in Germany, like the dominant culture has a problem with that. If it's harassment or something like that. And I don't know, it's quite concerning in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And who else wrote on the first question? Anyone who wanted to have what was your name?
Mine?
Yeah.
Kate.
Kate?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same way as what Anna was saying. Like, integration, when I was thinking about it, integration would just be so tough because even within Indigenous populations, like what you were saying about with Tuhoe and stuff like that, there are still going to be small populations that aren't going to integrate with the bigger population. Therefore, do you make 2 Indigenous psychologies, or do you? And then if you make 2, is someone else going to pop up and say that they don't want this one? You know, it's just, it seems to me that it would be a lot harder in practice than what it would be in theory. And I think it would be, yeah, it would be a long time before that would actually be, not necessarily just in New Zealand, but globally, to integrate. It would take a lot more than what's going on now. You know what I mean? Like it's, yeah.
Well, but you see, right now, the indigenization movement has only just begun. So I would say that right now there's a lot of emphasis on indigenization. There is a lot of emphasis on differentiation. And the integration is taking place, but certainly on a less of an emphasis than the indigenization and the differentiation. So that Anna's group, the Kiwi Chinese, would be unusual. Remember, they're a small minority relative to the number of ethnic Chinese living in New Zealand today. The vast majority of the first generation ones that have arrived in the last 20 years will very strongly differentiate themselves from the mainstream. So, yeah. Anybody else on question 1 that wanted to say anything?
Oh, do you want to go first? I didn't write anything since I'm just sitting in, but I guess as a response to that stuff, I wonder in a way if it matters, because wouldn't to some degree there be as many Indigenous psychologies as there are Indigenous practitioners, or do you know what I mean? Like you have a body of, say if it's Māori with, you know, different iwi and stuff practicing and drawing on it, I imagine that you have a body of literature and material that people draw on, but then still, you know, use it in a way that's specific, you know, and work.
What you need to think about is when and why do people create boundaries? You see what I'm saying? So that's exactly right. In terms of the practitioners, what we saw in the Native American one, and again, what would be typical here is that there's a body of work, and you draw from that body of work, and then you apply it in particular ways anyway. Because any given clinical application is going to be very specific to that practitioner and that client. It's a very particular relationship between 2 people that plays itself out in specific ways anyway.